Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight with the webinar, one of the webinars of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we're very honored to have with us Professor Ted London, Ford Motor Company Clinical Professor and Area Chair, Business Administration at the Ross School of Business, University of Michigan. He's going to speak about business models for the base of the
Hey, Ali, you went on mute.
Sorry about that. Okay. Enterprise-based approaches to poverty alleviation offer an exciting avenue for addressing one of society's most intractable problems. The promise is alluring, creating new business models that reduce impoverishment faced by the base of the pyramid while also generating profits. These new models have often failed to achieve sustainability at scale. The objective of this session is to present and discuss a new framework for assessing and enhancing business models in BoP market. This framework results in in-depth research and analysis of carefully selected set of enterprises with mixed success in attaining scale. Ted London, as I've mentioned, is the Ford Motor Company Clinical Professor and Area Chair of Business Administration in the University of Michigan, Ross School of Business. He's also a Senior Fellow, Research Fellow at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. He is, needless to say, an internationally recognized expert in the intersection of business strategy and poverty alleviation. Just to mention his book, The Base of the Pyramid Promise, Building Business and Impact and Scale, is translating over 25 years of research and expertise into actionable strategy, framework, and tools for managers seeking inclusive growth. I mean, I would highly recommend, if you want to really get deep into BoP, that's one of the books you need to read. Now, without much ado, Ted, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you, Ali, for having me. I was honored when you invited me, and I was delighted to come. As I watch the participants, I see some old friends, so thank you for joining, and I'm looking forward to meeting some new colleagues as well. So what I'm going to talk about is, I've not presented this before, so for me it was fun to have the opportunity to think about how I would put this together and present. It's research, but it's really meant to be actionable. So it's going to be focused more on the practical implications rather than talking about the contribution to theory. I think that's going to be fun. I'd love to hear what you guys think as we go through. I think it's going to take me 30 plus minutes to present, give or take, maybe a little more, but I think you'll find it interesting. And then we're going to have some time at the back end for Q&A. And I talked to Ali, and he's encouraged me, and I'm happy to do it, to stay on a little longer if people want to have a conversation past the 1 hour time frame. But we'll be sure that everything will be cleaned up by it's 1 o'clock. It'll be 1 o'clock my time, but wherever you guys are. So what I'll do now is I'm gonna kick off, show you my slides, and I'm gonna assume you guys can see this. Ali, can you give me the thumbs up? Can people see it? All right, I got thumbs up. Great, thank you guys. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about business models for the base of the pyramid. That's BoP, base of the pyramid. And I'll give you a little introduction to base of the pyramid and to business models. But the idea is that there are literally billions of people that are either not served or not served very well by the kind of the current global economic system, and an increasing number of companies are thinking about how do we reach them, and to really achieve the aspiration, it needs to be done at scale. So we're going to really focus on, to some degree, how do they go to scale with their business models. And this is a little bit, and some of you may know this is a little bit centered, or know of them, it's centered on Unilever's work in their Shakti initiative. But it extends beyond that, but I'm going to use that as sort of part of the example for the work that we do today. So this is sort of what a base of the pyramid market might look like when you look at it. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi from 1989 to 1991. I took this picture since then, but it gives you some sense of maybe what base of the pyramid might look like. Now let me switch to beginning. Why are companies interested in base of the pyramid? Well, they see it as an opportunity for business plus impact. So if you start looking at the numbers, you begin to think there's a lot of people out there that need one. In this case, 800 million people could look for better jobs. 3 billion people are looking for new energy solutions. 2.4 billion people are looking at sanitation, healthcare improvements. Almost 1 billion are looking for more food just to survive. And certainly nutrition is a huge issue. And those of you familiar with things like stunting in children, big implications. So these are all gigantic, enormous challenges, but they also sound like business opportunities, right? When you think about healthcare, you think about energy, you think about jobs, you think about nutrition, you think about food. These are all things that businesses think a lot about. So the challenge is that there are these social challenges that might be addressable by business solutions, but the key is to get the business model right. So what I want to do is talk about two things with regard to business models in the base of the pyramid. One is to talk about briefly why these models might be more challenging. And then I'll try and define at least what I mean by business model in this presentation. So in BoP markets, and this is a little oversimplistic, but I just called it, there are at least 4 I's that create challenges in building a sustainable, scalable business model. One is infrastructure. Certainly the physical infrastructure, roads are challenging, communication networks are challenging. And this affects the product and information flow, which means that you've got to think very carefully when you build your business model about how do you get the right, if you will, distribution submodel. Institutions are often limited or informal, and that impacts finance, property, legal. And that means you've got to think a little bit more carefully about your financing submodel. Impoverishment, there's ill-being in multiple dimensions, and that certainly impacts the sales submodel that you're going to put together. And finally, interest. There may not be awareness of the product or its potential benefits. So this has impacts on behavior change, and I'll call that the activation submodel. So if you're building a business model for the base of the pyramid, you need to think about all 4 of these and then how they are integrated together in your business model. And I've said a lot about business models. So here's how I'm going to define business model. And we could have a long debate. There is still an ongoing debate in strategy and other domains about what is a business model. But I'm going to call it saying it describes how businesses run and basically how distribution, sales, financing, activation models fit together. And it's different from strategy, right? Strategy explains what you do better than your rivals. Business models explain how you actually execute your strategy. And one way I like to think about it is if you're working with some partners, they might all have a different strategy for a particular opportunity, but the collective business model should be the same across the organizations. So different strategies, same business model. And then in this study, I'm not going to be thinking much about the making part of it, like how something is built in the business model. We're going to start with the idea that the product exists, and we're going to go from there and really look at customers, retailers, distributors. And what I want to build into the business model, and I think the value of the study that we're going to do is twofold for BoP business leaders. One thing I found is that and I've done this, I've been in this space as both a practitioner and an academic for more than 30 years. And one thing I found is that when you ask BoP leaders, can you draw your business model? They really struggle. They don't have all the pieces fit together. So we're going to first talk about how do you think about drawing a model? And this becomes the foundation. And I'm a firm believer, if you can draw it, one, you can communicate it better, but it also means you really understand it. So we'll talk a little bit about the flows and then how the submodels integrate. And then the second part of this, which I hope you'll find interesting, is the evaluation. And what are some key considerations that you need to incorporate when you're thinking about business models or scaling business models for the base of the pyramid? So that's kind of that's where we're heading with this. So this is just a brief upshot of what a business model design could look like. So this is really related to some work we did with Renket Ben Kaiser, or RB, in Pakistan. And they were interested in distributing products to low-income markets in rural Pakistan. And I'm not, this isn't meant to be the core study that we're going to talk about today, but just gives you an example. So they set up a separate venture that was called Saf Sahatman Services. And the way they thought about it, and we work with them on this, is to begin to think about this business model as really being 4 different components. One was really thinking about the sales network, and they had an APA network. And how do they actually close the deal in the community? And what does this look like, and how is it managed? And again, I'm not going to go into this, just give you a sense that we really built this out so they could understand how this part operated. And then there was a whole activation that a lot of people in the community, while the APAs might be there, they didn't really understand the product benefits. Or even sometimes the product category. So what was the awareness campaign, and how did that look, and who ran it? And then there was the whole idea that for this to work, you have to distribute the right products at the right time, at the right place. How does that flow, and how does that all connect? And then there was a financing aspect. Both there needed to be financing for the APAs so they could continue to grow. And then what was the financing for the enterprise? And then finally, the enterprise itself needed to manage all of these in a way that they were integrated and could, if you will, we'll talk about the scale in tandem. So that's kind of an illustration of a business model. And we work with the board, and they were really delighted to begin to better understand how the business model all came together in the different pieces. And this is just one model. And then there are certainly others. And, I'm not going to go through each one. Some of them may be familiar to you. But that's what, we've done a lot of work in really trying to understand the different pieces of the model, how they flow. And this takes a fair amount of time, as those of you who've done this, to know how do you get something complicated and make it fairly simple and straightforward, but also encompassing. So these are just some other different business models where you see the overall model, and then you think about what are the key aspects of the model. So some of you may know MCOPA, which they're really focusing on how do they enable in affordability and build out customer continuity. So that's their big strategy. The model is really around pay as you go, and actually offering that, although they start with solar, they actually have a wide product portfolio to ensure customer continuity. And then this is how the model flows. So that's the business model idea. And I've talked a little bit about base of the pyramid and why it's a little more challenging to build business models. So let me tell you about the study, and I'll do it in the framework of Shakti. And I've worked with Unilever for almost 2 decades, I think now. And one of the things that they found is they have got this Shakti model, and they've scaled it to over 120,000 agents, or what they call Shakti entrepreneurs, in India. It's profitable. It's a big part of their business. And they've taken that model to other places, including Ethiopia, and have had much more of a challenge scaling. So it's the same organization, 2 different markets, very different outcomes. So why? What's really driving that? In some sense, the markets they're looking at are the same base of the pyramid. There are some contextual differences, but the broad context is fairly similar, at least in terms of the challenges versus their existing distribution to higher income communities in either Ethiopia or India. So, this is really what it looks like. This would be a Shakti entrepreneur in India, and they will often either go to door, or they will have their own their shops. So this is sort of what it looks like. There are smaller packets, sometimes called sachets, so they make them more affordable. And really, what they are thinking about, what's consistent for Unilever across the model is, they have their existing brands. So they're promoting brands is a big part of what they want to do. And it's wrapped into a model that encourages women's empowerment. So they really want to say that we're going to use our existing brands, and you'll hear the term wherever they go, Shakti entrepreneur or Shakti agent. So those become the different approaches. those become the consistencies that they bring from market to market. And we did this work over the summer with Unilever. It was during COVID, so we weren't able to travel, but we had extensive interviews with the teams in Ethiopia and India to really understand what was going on. And what was interesting was this is the first time Unilever had let anyone this deeply into their models to really understand what was going on. Bucks Akinche was our sort of key contact at Unilever. And I have a really brief video of Bucks, and it kind of I just want to give you a little context. So I'm going to play the video. You'll hear from Bucks. You'll hear him talking a little bit about India and the other places, and that'll just sort of set the stage for where we're going with the rest of the presentation. Let me know, Ali, if you can hear this.
Hi,
Sure.
I'm Ted London, a faculty member at the Ross School of
We
Business.
can hear it. It's a podcast, huh?
And today I'm here with Bucks Akinche, who is a global sustainability manager at Unilever. Bucks, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You started in India more than a decade ago with Shakti. How has that grown? What's the size of the initiative now in India?
India is a bit of a beast of an initiative now. We've got over 100,000 women across many villages in India selling Unilever products now. And in many instances, we also have their husbands who have decided that they are going to join them to actually run these small micro enterprises. So we have 100,000 women who we directly reach. We have tens of thousands of husbands who've come on board with them. But the beauty of it is over the last 10 years, we've now expanded Shakti beyond India. And we now have Shakti running in about 10 other countries across Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So in Africa, we've got the program in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in Ghana, in Latin America, in Guatemala and Colombia, and in Southeast Asia very recently, we launched the program in Myanmar.
So a lot of expansion.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just stop there. It gives you a sense of that, you know, kind of the process we use. Obviously, Bucks this was an interview we had done a little sooner, so we were able to do it in person. Most of the other things we did were remote. All right, let's see. Oh, and I should say, this is the team. I should give credit. So these are mainly, and since I'm at the Ross School of Business, these are either Ross graduates that I've worked with for a while, or they were existing MBA students deeply interested in this work and had been teaching assistants for me when I was teaching, or when I am teaching. So it was a very good team. So I'll start and I cannot cover everything that's going on in the model. So I want to kind of give you some big highlights and some of the big takeaways we had. First, for what maybe was driving success in India. And then I'll shift over to talk about Ethiopia and maybe some of the reasons why they had challenges in that model. So this is rural India. And again, this is just, you know, coming back to maybe the 4 I's that I talked about, that certainly the opportunity space in rural India is immense. 900 million consumers and incomes rising. And what's interesting, interest-wise, Unilever's brands are fairly well known throughout the country, even in rural areas. There is certainly limitations in infrastructure and institutions as you go further into rural areas, and impoverishment on many dimensions, including women's empowerment, where there is variation in terms of how much empowerment women have based on what's, if you will, it maybe is an overly broad marker, but what state they reside in within India, different cultures and customs. Some more conservative rural regions sustain what you might call traditional gender roles and inequality. So that had some impact. All right, so what we tried to do is say, okay, what does the model look like, the business model look like prior to the arrival of Shakti? So what's going on and how is Unilever serving both urban India and then rural India? So I just highlight this. If we had more time, I'd be happy to walk you through the whole model. But what I really want to highlight here is that prior to Shakti, the distributors, so these were independent distributors, they only went to either they really served 30 to 60 kilometer radius around their location. And they were usually located in a large town, and then they would serve some of the smaller surrounding towns. But anyone that was further than that, and that was the majority of India, the retailer had to actually come to the distributor to pick up their stock. That meant they had to close their shop for at least part of a day. That meant they had to incur the costs of traveling there and then bringing the products back. So it was costly for them to do that. It made it less attractive. And this, as some of you have heard, this sort of reflects in the idea that often the poor have to pay more. It's more costly for them to get the same products than the rich. So that was their existing model, and it wasn't focused in basically the distributors that Unilever worked with didn't see the opportunity to move into rural areas, and they didn't really have the capabilities to do it. They had the capabilities to distribute, but not necessarily to generate the demand for these products. So what Unilever did, and it's a little bit oversimplistic here because there was a few other stages that happened, but they basically built a plug and play distribution model. And they worked with their longtime partner in India, Hindustan Field Services, to build out a model where they use something called RSPs, or rural sales promoters, and Hindustan Field Services manage this. So lots of details here, but basically there's a third party that Unilever has worked with for many years that now manages a sales network. Okay, and it involves rural sales promoters overseeing Shakti entrepreneurs. And what happens now in this model is the difference is, and I'll explain why, they've set it up in ways that make sense for the distributor to now distribute product to the rural areas. And it has to do with being able to go to a particular place at a particular time, knowing how much they're going to be able to deliver. And they're only worried about delivering, not generating sales. And the Shakti entrepreneurs are expected to provide their own working capital. So there's a clear selection process in who can be a Shakti entrepreneur because of the need for them to have working capital. And finally, most of Unilever's products are well known. Thus, there isn't that much required in terms of demand creation, or what we call the activation submodel. So all of the sales, the working capital, and the activation are all handled within this model here. And all of that is overseen by Hindustan Field Services, HFS. And what happens is, if you remember the old model, what they've done is just plugged this model into the existing distributor network, right? So it becomes a model that is fairly easy for an existing distributor to adopt. In some sense, they're saying, we are going to build a sales network that runs alongside yours, and we are going to generate demand, and then we're going to ask you to fulfill that demand. And that's a pretty easy yes for the distributors to make. And that's sort of, and there's a lot more to it. And I'm going to talk about some of the strengths, but that's the broad model. I think I'm going to let this one go. So again, they have reached 120,000 entrepreneurs. So they've scaled up over the past decades significantly. It's something that they see as both a business, but also having social impact. So they see it also as important, particularly in terms of women's empowerment. So what has driven performance? So I'm going to put 5 things here, and there's more detail, but I just want to give you a high level overview. So one was they decided, although it's a business initiative with social impacts, the goals are business led, or business goals led, right? There are social impact boundary conditions, meaning every entrepreneur, every node needs to be a woman. And that's very important for women's empowerment. But they really see this, and this isn't to say one is better than the other, but they're very clear that this is a sales channel that also generates social impacts. And that guides a lot of the decision making when they have to make decisions about where do we focus our KPIs and other metrics on. It is by the history of Hindustan Lever, there is high brand awareness, so behavior change is not required. The model is really about the demand fulfillment. They're very thoughtful about the right Shakti. So what they are looking for is Shakti entrepreneurs who have their own stores, have access to working capital, and actually are well respected in the community, because these Shakti entrepreneurs also become the delivery point for other local stores in the community. So not only are the Shaktis selling in their own stores, they're actually distributing or sub-distributors to other stores within their close geographical range. So they become sub-distributors as well. And they're very, very thoughtful about this. They believe this has impacts on women's empowerment, but they are not picking the women that are most disadvantaged. So they're not saying, by doing this, we'll find the women that could benefit the most. They're saying we can find the women that can use this model most effectively to generate sales. So a very important distinction in terms of selecting the right entrepreneur. They're also leveraging existing assets. They're thinking about what's de novo, what do we need to build? And then what is it that we can borrow, or the idea of bricolage, what can we take and use already? And they developed an entirely new sales channel, which is de novo, but then they embedded it in an existing distribution infrastructure. So some parts were new, and they were very careful about building that out in a thoughtful way, and piloting and making sure they had this in the right selection for the Shakti entrepreneurs, and thinking about working capital. But then they said, we don't want to specialize in distribution. It's not something we're going to focus on. Let's get this built into our existing distribution model. And then they enabled learning and optimization. So they were very thoughtful again about, as we said, the Shakti selection. And that actually, the model evolved as they went into different regions. So as you heard Buck say, in some regions, women were able to run this pretty much independently. In others, their husbands became much more engaged in more conservative regions. So they began to think about what part of the model is standardized and what part of the model needs to be customized. And that got them thinking very clearly about what's our competitive advantage in this, and how do we make sure we transfer our competitive advantage from place to place while also being able to customize to local context. And this also applied to thinking about what's the right geographic location, where are the right places where there's sufficient demand, and then what are the right products that we need to include in this model as we go from place to place. So there was a lot of learning and optimization that was built into the model. There are some limitations. Just to be clear, there's no perfect model, and I'm not here to say that Unilever is by any means stellar in everything. Certainly, they are limited in the way they've designed this model to only promote products that fulfill, that are based on demand fulfillment. They have tried others, which requires more demand creation, where individuals in the community don't necessarily fully understand the benefits. That has not worked particularly well for them. And then certainly the growth is constrained because smaller villages even now are still excluded. In terms of impacts, we talked about this. The impact on women changes as the model for the Shakti changes, which is important to understand, but they understood this. And again, the selection of Shaktis is based on a set of criteria which tends to exclude perhaps the most disadvantaged women. And finally, the product categories are generally present in the community. So this means that the impact from a product perspective is more about trusted brands. Often there are counterfeit products and other things. So one thing with a brand is you should be able to get consistency. So people would benefit from being more confident of the quality of what they're buying. And certainly that might also exclude certain products that you might say these have even more social benefit. It doesn't fit the model for what they're trying to do, so they don't end up in the basket that they're distributing. So that was some of the highlights that we extracted from India and some of the limitations. And then I want to juxtapose that with Ethiopia, where the successes have been more modest. So Ethiopia, in some respects, a lot of similarities to India. Certainly a fair amount of social impoverishment as you go into rural areas. Women obligated to stay close to home, a high amount of malnutrition, similar challenges in limitations in institutions and infrastructure. One difference, perhaps, that's very important is there is a very robust regulatory environment that has some control over business, both who can enter the country and then what types of licenses and things like that are needed. So this is, again, going back, this is the model that Unilever uses, and it's very much centered towards working with urban retailers. And basically the same idea is any retailers outside of the footprint of their distributors must come to the distributor or a wholesaler to get their product. So again, they have to close the shop, travel, and then they're responsible for transporting the goods back to their communities. And it all is very data dark in the sense that Unilever has no real insight into this model. And they also work with a partner similar to HFS. It's actually the same company, Smolin, called Way Marketing, that supports Unilever's urban-based distribution programs. So this is Tim KleinBen, who's the country director, head of Unilever Ethiopia. And he says, if we want to achieve our dreams, our ambitions of creating a successful and lasting business, we need to find commercially viable ways to serve the community in rural areas. With our established route to market, that's not possible. It's not commercially viable. So he's sort of thinking that we can't work with our existing distributors. It's not going to work. So what they began to do is say, could we find a partner organization? And they ended up working with Kadami Mart, run by Shani Sembeta, Ethiopian-based organization. And there's a link there. So if you're interested in knowing more, you can just Google Kagami Mart, and there's an interesting YouTube video so you can see a little bit more from Kagami Mart's perspective about how this model has unfolded. But basically, Unilever engaged Kadami Mart to run the entire operation for them in terms of serving base of the pyramid. They had several iterations in their model as they went over time, but basically Kadami Mart works with Unilever, and they've identified some other suppliers. One of the challenges is people aren't that familiar with Unilever products, and even some of the product categories, people aren't that aware of, say, oral hygiene. So they wanted to bring some other products that were more familiar. So trying to figure out how do we, overcoming the need for demand creation or creating awareness of products by bringing some products like cooking oil and other things that were more based on demand fulfillment. So getting people to come and then trying to get them to buy products they might not be as familiar with. In this case, Kadami Mart, here you can see they handle all of the distribution. They also oversee the sales force. It's the same model with the rural sales promoters working with agents. The agents generally are responsible for doing the activation. And in this model, and it's caused them quite a bit of challenges, the working capital is provided by Kadami Mart for the women entrepreneurs. So this was the model that they used, and I'm going to highlight maybe some of the challenges they faced in implementing this model and align it back to what we heard from India. So again, here's a picture. This gives you a sense of what rural Ethiopia looks like. And for them, they said revenues and agent growth is yet to meet expectations. Why have they had trouble scaling this model? Here are, I'm going to have a couple of slides just to talk about some of the things they were doing in some limitations. So I frame these. One is keep doing but improve effectiveness, and the other is maybe they need to start doing this themselves. So one is Unilever certainly was able to identify partners to support them, including Kadami Mart. So they said, we're going to work with Kadami Mart, and they have the required licensing. And we're also going to get some funding from Unilever and some outside parties, including DFID. And because they were working with an independent organization, Kadami Mart, that organization itself could be the one that's funded. So they could get funding from DFID to go not to Unilever, but to Kadami Mart. And DFID is the Department for International Development from the United Kingdom. They also were able to adapt the business model based on learnings from the field. So they were, over time, Unilever was revising the, if you will, the contract with Kadami Mart to figure out how do we improve both our sales and our working capital models. And I'll highlight some of the challenges that they faced in doing that, but they kept trying to improve it. And I think that was good. And they were very, very, very social impact oriented. And Kadami Mart was very keen, and their mission was really, although they were a business organization, they were really focused on empowering women, particularly the most disadvantaged women in rural Ethiopia. So there was the idea that they were empowering women. A lot of products either were very poor or didn't even exist, so they were offering better products and new product categories. So there was a fair amount of social impact built into this model. Improvements required. Kadami Mart was not a sales first organization. They were a social impact first organization. And this had a lot of implications in terms of how they went about their strategizing. So for one, and I think it comes up in a couple points down, but just to give you an example, when they were recruiting Shakti entrepreneurs, they were saying, we want to find the entrepreneurs we can have the greatest impact on. And they would find the most disadvantaged, identify some of the most disadvantaged women. Now, I'm not going to say this is good or bad. The challenge, however, was that the women were expected to be able to do demand creation for Unilever products. So they were selecting based on, to a large measure, how disadvantaged they were, not necessarily on their sales skills. And there was a big disconnect in terms of being able to execute. The organization didn't have an established distribution network. And that meant they had to build these capabilities, which was a real challenge. And they decided early on that they were going to distribute in 3 or 4 states across Ethiopia. So a pretty wide spread. So I think you could say it was sort of an inefficient, perhaps clustering of distribution early on. And also, they needed to build these capabilities as well. So when you're struggling with a very large geographic reach and still trying to build distribution, that can be challenging. They did need to really think about demand creation. And this wasn't something that was really built into either the selection of the women or sort of how they would go about promoting the products themselves. There wasn't a real clarity between business goals and social impact goals. For example, the debt collection. So what was happening was the women were accruing debt. So they were given the products and then asked to repay a certain percentage before they could get the next batch of products. And what was happening was some of the women were defaulting. And there was a decision, which was, from a social benefit side, we want to keep working with these women, encouraging them and helping them through difficult times. From a business side, it's a real challenge because once some women see their counterparts not paying, they may decide not to pay themselves. So there was a large accumulation of debt because they said, we really want to make sure that we keep working with these women and get the social impact that we hope for. And that had some, and I'm not going to say which one's better, because this is all about making the right strategic decision, but that decision had implications on the sustainability of the business model. And the other thing they were struggling with is they weren't able to scale the 4 different models in tandem in terms of, can they distribute the right products at the right time? Did the women have the right amount of working capital when they need it? Are the sales and activation models all occurring together so that the demand is there? And they weren't really working well. So that is to some degree the challenges. And what I'm going to do is, I see the time. So what I'd like to do is sort of summarize what we saw as sort of, as you're thinking about building BoP business models, what were some of the key considerations and questions that you'd want to think about within these models. So there are 8, and I'll go through each one briefly, and then we should have 10 to 15 minutes at the end where I can enlighten further areas that I maybe skipped over a little bit quickly, or also talk a little bit more about these. And I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think about these considerations. So let me run through each one. So what I've done, as I said, what's the key consideration? So your BoP business model requires operational excellence regardless of social impact goals. And the reason I put this is sometimes there's a sense, well, if we're doing social impact, we don't need to be as rigorous in our business. And if you want to scale, it has to be rigorous. Now, I'm not going to, we're going to come up to something in a moment about the financial returns, but in terms of being rigor, it's critical. And in the way, a key question to think about, I think is really important is, do you have the ability to scale those submodels, the distribution, the sales, the activation, and the financing models in tandem? And if you don't have that ability, then the operational rigor and excellence is not in place. And these are some sub questions, which again, I can come back to any of these, but what I'm trying to do is promote people to think first about the sub question, the big issue, the kind of a core question, and then some assessments. For example, across all the submodels, does your governance structure enable integrative action? Can they work together? Who's managing this to make the decisions across the models? Your BoP business models requires net profitability only across the aggregation of submodels, in the sense that in total, it needs to be profitable, because if it's not profitable, it's not scalable. However, what you need to understand is which parts of the model are generating profits and which ones might only be generating cost, and how do you balance that out? And that becomes critical in thinking about this, right? And it changes if different people own different parts of the model. And this has a lot to do then thinking about how are margins distributed across the model? How are different costs covered? Are there incentives in place for activation related to sales generation? So how do you begin to think about each of the models individually? And then really critically, how do they aggregate up into a net profitability? Your business model requires partners in capital that value both financial and social impact. This gets to the idea of in this space, where is the capital coming from? This is, you're innovating. Where is the capital for working capital coming from? Is there patience? What does this begin to look like? If you're working with partners, who are they? And these are often sometimes nonprofits. So what does that begin to look like? How do you think about the right set of partners and capital? Your business model requires balancing bricolage and de novo. Are you really thinking about what it is that you want to build from scratch and what it is that you're going to leverage that already exists? And this becomes a critical part of building the business model, is what is it that we can leverage? Because if you're doing everything on your own, it becomes really, really hard to be efficient. But if you can't leverage or use bricolage everywhere, because if it was already existed, it would have been done already. So what's the right balance between building something new and leveraging what already exists? And this is critical. Do you understand where your competitive advantage lies, right? So this gets to how do you win in the marketplace? And one of the things is, what is standardized and goes from place to place, and what can be customized? And this gets into some real important questions that I think a lot of BoP enterprises aren't really thinking about in their business model. We've talked a lot about this. How do you align the need for demand creation and demand fulfillment? Do you have a strategy, right? Are your products aligned? Are they all demand fulfillment? Are they all demand creation? How is your product basket lined up? If it's demand creation, what needs to be done and who's going to do it? What part of the model? How do you address the balance between business and social goals? And you need to be explicit. And again, it's not that one is better than the other, The challenge becomes in these models is not being clear about how you make decisions between those and how those decisions float across the entire business model and all the submodels. And finally, do you have a deep understanding of your social impact? Do you really, in this space, you have to know the positives and negatives and how confident you might be of your claims? Is this model really about women's empowerment? Is it about new product availability? What is the impact? And this has implications for your stakeholders that are engaged in the model and also external stakeholders that are looking at the model. So that's my last slide, is this one. Again, I think that for BoP enterprises to succeed and scale in this space, two things have to happen. One is they need to gain a deeper, richer understanding of their business model. And in some sense, they need to create a business model that aligns with the strategy of all the different strategies of all the partners. Does everyone have a consistent view of the business model? Does it really explain what's going on? And does it highlight kind of what's new versus what used to be? And then as you've built this business model, have you really thought about these 8 considerations and how have you built them into the design and the scale of the model? So I'm looking at 46 after. I'm going to stop here. Happy to go in, go back, review anything. It's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. And that's what the Q&A is about, is kind of providing more detail. So Ali, I guess I'll turn it over to you. But this was fun. So, like I said, it's the first time I've done this. I'd love to get your feedback and thoughts.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks a lot. Unilever use its model, and they say that in Egypt, they say it is adopted the Avon or the Tupperware kind of a model, where you give the women like a bag with products, and the women would distribute it, and then she takes a charge. She takes like a percentage of what she sells. And the last thing I remember is that they had a problem with the managing the logistics, that they have to sort of revamp and start from scratch. I don't think they ever reach the 100,000. I mean, India is just huge in scale. It's slightly very different. And I think by design, it is very much handicapped. It's very much restricted. Now, my question is very different to you. My question is most of the BoP model, when we talk about a commercial or private, we tend to talk about a big daddy kind of a model, a big brother kind of a model, a big company like Unilever, and it's going to include small players into their value chain. So they're going to live on Unilever. We rarely talk about models where you get the BoP community to sort of collaborate or lead or own on their own. So that gives them a little bit more of a leverage.
That's a great question. So just to broaden, yes, the Unilever model, there's nothing really unique about this idea of, like you said, Tupperware or anything else. The challenge is actually executing in a BoP context, the context of such impoverishment. So that's the real challenge behind it. It's just basically they're providing products through a distributor to a salesperson who then sells it. And it's just, they happen to, use it at the individual agent level. But these agents often have stores, depending on the country. So you could say it's a way of supplying stores too. You're raising a really interesting question, which is about impact, right? Which is where, what's the type of impact you aspire to generate? So in Unilever's model, and again, I'm not defending models. I'm trying to be analytical about it. Their model is based on, one, we are empowering women. We're giving them opportunities they wouldn't normally have had. And in some cases, we're providing products that weren't previously available, or in most cases, they presume that the products they're offering are better than the existing off brands. So they're seeing the benefits to the women, and then, sort of like maybe in the United States and elsewhere, the arrival of Walmart, right? people go to Walmart, it benefits the shoppers, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the existing other retailers. So there's always pros and cons. When I worked in Malawi, we worked a lot with empowering local businesses. And that's certainly another strategy that can be very powerful. Building from the bottom up, that is a little different from base of the pyramid, right? Base of the pyramid model, and again, it's not a better or worse, it's really about a non-local player entering a local market. Working with small and micro enterprise development, that's been around for decades. It was in the 80s, and that was really good, but the challenge was scale. And those models really had difficulty going to scale. So that's a separate and equally important question, is how do you take a smaller BoP enterprise or an enterprise owned by the base of the pyramid and try and scale that? Equally important question, but it would be a different business model and a different set of business model questions. And again, I'm not saying one is better than the other. These are two different approaches, and both need to be thought about very, very carefully.
Yeah. Just a comment, and then I'm going to start taking questions. We have lots of questions. Danone, when they collect milk from small producers, and they work with care with this, they try to sort of form a cooperative of milk collectors, and they actually encourage them to sort of serve other than Danone. And that gives them eventually, they become an enterprise in their own, and they really serve Danone, but they're not really tied to Danone. So I think there are ways where you could sort of wean them away from the dominance of a big multinational like Unilever.
Yeah, I think this is what gets really interesting, right? Is the challenge for us is we need more of these different types of models, and we need them to go to scale. So what we should be doing is looking at each one of these approaches and saying, okay, what's working, what's not working? How can we make it work better in new locations? And what we've seen is a lot of ad hoc models where there's one example here, one example there, but there isn't any ability to replicate, to build more models like that. You know, we've worked with Danone in Nigeria, and you know, with nutrition, and trying to get more nutritional products out to particularly to women of reproductive age. So the goal there is about improving nutrition, and it's about, can we avoid stunting and things like that. So the focus again with Danone in this project, and we could critique it, but it's not about building local entrepreneurs. It's about thinking about what's the most efficient way to improve maternal health. And we could argue that's not the best impact, but it's one impact that this model is really keen to do. And if they were to aspire to do something else, and this gets back to balancing business and social goals, would that impact the ability to scale? And I don't know the answer to that because it wasn't tested.
Okay, I have lots of questions. I'm going to start by Hazim Fahmy. Hazim, would you please unmute and ask your question? Hazim?
Yeah, I was working on my unmute button. Thank you, Ali.
No worries.
Basically, my question is around technology. And has there been in any of the models that you've studied so far, use of technology to the point where it can introduce efficiency into the value chain, almost like Uberizing parts of the submodels or an entire submodel perhaps?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And the answer is for most of these organizations, having an IT backbone of some sort becomes critical. If you go beyond Unilever to places, things like in Kenya and M-Kopa and others, being able to use mobile telephony to do some of this becomes a critical part of the model. So yes, I see technology as being a critical part, and maybe I need to introduce that into this set of criteria, because technology is really important to manage efficiencies. It's, you know, relying on paper is really, really hard. So I think that's a great point.
Okay.
And yes,
question from Buddy Easer.
Yes, thank you, Ali. Ted, my question is, between the model that you described in India and Ethiopia, there were clear things where it didn't work. Is that because they had the wrong framework, or the market was just so different that even if they had said same criteria, it wouldn't have worked?
Yeah. So I don't know what the counterfactual will be, since they haven't got it right. But I think a big part of this was recognizing that, this gets back to one of the questions. Are you, do you need to think about demand creation to demand fulfillment? So it was very much a demand creation model. So that means everything needs to be lined up to facilitate demand creation, including the selection of the Shakti entrepreneurs. They were trying to build out their basket so that they could have some other products that might generate interest, like cooking oil, so that it was beyond just Unilever products in this case. But those relationships were very difficult for them to be able to generate. So the context will change, but I'd like to believe the key considerations in building the model won't, and having to get them aligned. But Buddy, that question of whether it's demand creation or demand fulfillment flows through the whole thing. And that became a challenge because the context was different, and they may not have adjusted to that context.
Okay, I have a question from Mr. Abdul Samit Pulater, and he wants me to read it, so I'll read it. He says, may I learn what you think about the reverse logistics in these models? Are the quality product differentiate lower quality? Lower quality for the BoP market? Are you planning to conduct a webinar which discusses BoP as supplier?
Good questions. There seems like a lot in there, so I'll try and tackle a couple of them. So one of the things you have to think about in the product that or service you're providing is, and some people say, why not add, say, mobile telephony to this model? Well, the challenge for some models is they're, if you will, to some degree, the information is unidirectional. The products go out, the services go out, but they're not able to address, for example, servicing needs, or if it's mobile telephony, providing perhaps the government required information back up. So sometimes the reverse logistics aren't in place to actually offer certain products. And yes, selling to the base of or buying from the base of the pyramid is another model. It's certainly about agriculture and other things. Although even in those models, what you often see is that half of the model is about providing, for example, better inputs or better seeds or fertilizer, which in turn is still selling to the base of the pyramid. So even though, the idea is we're going to work with the base of the pyramid to buy their produce, you often need to provide them better inputs. So you still have to think about selling. So I don't necessarily always see a clear distinction between buying from and selling to. I see them as overlapping, and again, equally important.
Okay, I have a question from Mr. Douglas Clark. Please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Appreciate this presentation, and I'm just wondering about the findings and implications of this study. Do you plan to disseminate it further through a book or white paper or some kind of article or other vehicle?
The simple answer is yes. This is, like I said, this is the first time I've done it. It's not meant necessarily as a presentation about Unilever. It is meant as a presentation about business models, of which I wanted to use our recent work with Unilever to help set up kind of how we came to the findings. But they're certainly built off a whole lot of other business models that we've worked with. And my goal is to publish it. I would aspire probably more to a practice-oriented journal would be where I'd be heading. So that is definitely my goal. And that's why we do this work is, while we like working with, say, RB or Danone or Unilever, our goal is not necessarily, I want to help them be more successful, but the big idea is, can we build better businesses that have a net positive impact on the base of the pyramid? And, we work with different partners to understand what's working and not working, and then try and figure out what are best practices. And that's sort of my goal then would be, of course, to share those.
Great, thank you.
A question from Stephen Spalding. Stephen, please unmute and ask your question, please.
Sure. Professor Lin, question for you. In your experience, where does a company considering expanding into the BoP have to land on the balance between for-profit versus the social aim? And said in a very polarizing way, do you think a company can be successful if it's really only interested in making money, and that's going to be key KPIs or benchmarks for success, and isn't necessarily considering the social aim, or does a company have to probably have both to make this successful?
Stephen, I can't see your picture, but I'm assuming this is the Stephen from Ross, right? Stephen Spalding.
Yes, it is.
Good to see you. It's been a while. So at some point we'll have to actually reconnect outside of this. So thanks for joining. But
absolutely. Yes.
So good questions. They're sort of nested in each other. Legal structure, in addition to sort of fixing mission, often has a big impact on access to capital. So sometimes if you're thinking about scale, a for-profit might offer you the opportunity to get investment capital, and a nonprofit might offer you the opportunity to get grant capital. And what you're beginning to see is there's a hybrid where different sources of capital are available because there's a mixed model here. I think, and this is, to me, this is a core thing to remember. When I ask people why do companies exist? What's the purpose of a company? And how are they successful? A lot of people say, well, they're there to create value or they're there to maximize shareholder returns. The companies exist to create value. And then if they can generate enough value and then capture some of that, then they have profits that they can then choose to distribute to their shareholders, including their stakeholders, including their shareholder. But they have to create value. And one way companies can create value is by alleviating poverty. And if you're not alleviating poverty, it's very, very hard to create value in a base of the pyramid context. So in some respects, and it's not a perfect correlation, but the idea of selling something that people desire and alleviating poverty are actually tied together in this space. And I think companies fail when they forget this. And they think about, I understand what people want, therefore they're going to have this. They don't understand kind of poverty and the implications and how it might be alleviated. And I think the business models become more powerful when poverty alleviation is directly linked to value creation, which is then directly linked to the opportunity for value capture. So in some respects, it almost has to start with alleviating poverty. And I believe you've got to have a business orientation to scale. What I didn't focus on, and this is more in play depending on who you get your capital from, is what is the appropriate return to those that have invested in the business. And that there's a lot of, we could talk a long time about that and how those models change depending on if you get some grant capital, say from DFID or somewhere like that, or from CARE. They're not interested in getting part of your profits. So they could provide capabilities and resources, and they're looking for a different kind of return. So the return model is interesting and requires some thought. But I do believe that it has to be business oriented, whether it's embedded in a for-profit or a nonprofit model.
Okay, I'm going to take two more questions. One of them is from Samah, and it's back to basics. Samah, please ask your question. Unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation, and I thought it was very, very interesting from my perspective, because I did not study business at all. I'm political science and international relations, and now I work in the UN actually, and I thought it would be very interesting to learn more and how to develop my skills. And I wanted to ask you, what's your latest book that maybe I could read to get further information and learn way more from this business model? Thank you.
My latest book is it's The Base of the Pyramid Promise.
There it is.
Oh, there it is. Thank you, Ali. So in that book, as well as what you're seeing here, is what I'm really trying to do is understand best practices. So, I'm at a business school, and we have an amazing program here at the University of Michigan. And we spend a lot of time teaching our students what are the right tools and frameworks to increase the likelihood of success by business. And the challenge is most of those tools and frameworks were built for businesses that are serving the wealthy. So my goal is, can we build tools and frameworks that business leaders can use that are interested in building businesses that are serving the less wealthy? And I think if we aspire to have an impact, and if we aspire to have these kinds of enterprises really go, we have to understand best practices. And we can't see these enterprises, making the same mistakes over and over again. They have to be better over time. So that's my goal. And that goes back to the earlier question about what am I going to do with this work? My goal is to refine this and how it's presented. I think the objective would be to use some of your feedback even, just to kind of make this clearer and tighter, so that this can be put together in a way that provides important insights to business leaders thinking about business models, in particular in this space. I love these questions.
Great. We have another question from Abdul Samad Pulater. Let me read it. Do you think that in investigating BoP models from business ecosystem, hold on a second, from perspective by including other governmental organizations, for example, there are development agencies in Turkey, and these kind of organizations can support BoP operation. So he's basically saying that it's an ecosystem and there are other players who could contribute.
Yeah, so that kind of gets to and maybe I've got to do this, but this idea that partners matter, right? Partners in capital that value both financial and social impact returns. I think that's absolutely true. That in these markets, it's difficult to do everything at the same level of profitability that you would be able to do it in a higher income market. So sometimes having to find other partners to help facilitate this that aren't as interested in the financial returns, but maybe more interested in the social returns, allows these models to come together. So what you're talking about in Turkey and elsewhere, I think, is spot on.
Super. I think we'll stop here. We're almost like 10 minutes after the hour. Ted, I really want to thank you for a very insightful webinar and a great discussion. I have to mention, I've attended back in 2013, the William Davidson Institute. There was a BoP Summit 2013, creating an action agenda for the next decade. You were the chairman of the conference. This was really an eye-opener for me. Even before I took charge of the Gerhard Center, this was what really got me into the whole issue of base of the pyramid. The amount of people we've met there. And if you look at some of the webinars, either before or after, you can see the influence that this has made. So I really thank you for your time, that you use us to sort of present something for the first time. I really thank you for that.
Thank you. I enjoyed the questions. I enjoyed the chance to share some of this, and it's been a pleasure. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for all the great work you were doing, Ali. It's amazing.
Thank you, sir. Now, we look forward for seeing you all next week. The focus for next week is going to be finance for social impact. On Monday, February 8th, we're going to have Mike O'Leary and Warren Valdemanas. They both had a recent book called Accountable, The Rise of Citizen Capitalism, which is basically they're going to talk about impact investment and what's wrong with impact investment. On Wednesday, February 10th, we're going to actually have another one of the BoP Lab Network member, which is Vanina Farber. Vanina is a professor of social innovation at IMD. She's going to talk about mobilizing private capital to speed and scale social innovation. So I look forward to seeing you all. Stay safe and stay happy. Thank you again, Ted.
Thank you.